Hello, this is Julian with Coffee Reviews, and today we'll be reviewing the Terraza wash processed Colombia from Monogram Coffee. And there's a bag right there. And Monogram, based out of Calgary, Alberta, and they were a suggestion to us by One Man's Chorus. So shout out to and thank you to One Man's Chorus for the suggestion. This is part one of a 3-part series featuring Monogram and their first ever appearance on this channel. Though they are a coffee roaster I do have familiarity with dating back to before the start of this channel, meaning it has been over 3 years since I've last had one of Monogram's coffees. But the main reason for this series is because Monogram did win our July Coffee of the Month poll, meaning that our next review will be the Bambito, but it also gives us an opportunity to try out some other coffees from Monogram, including this wash processed Colombian coffee. So we will see how this one turned out, as this right here is day 36. And recipe we went with for this coffee was Monogram's recipe, which is a 16:1 water to coffee ratio, brewed at 93 degrees Celsius, about 200 degrees Fahrenheit. I like this one best through the V60, which indicates a more medium fine grind. Roast profile for this one, it's actually in line with my expectations. Now, my memories did recall this one being maybe on the slightly more developed side of things relative to a lot of the other stuff that we do review. I would say that it is a little bit more traditional, that kind of later 2010s sort of coffee, in the sense that it's most closely aligned with the more developed side of a light medium. Maybe not quite as developed as something that Say produces these days, but even then it's definitely still on the more developed side of that light medium in terms of that roast profile. With that out of the way, let's go ahead and start discussing this coffee. Day 14, first impression, and opted for the Chemex with this one, and surprisingly, it came out with much more of a fruit vibrancy than initially expected, as there was a very strong grape sweetness right at the forefront of the cup. In addition to that, there was a slight spice-like quality to kind of complement the noticeable development of this one, but it did offer a fair bit more depth than I might have expected going into it, so overall, a little bit more fruit forward than I might have expected, leading to a much more positive result. Day 16 opted for the V60, and I was immediately impressed by the vibrancy and structure that this cup did offer, as it did have the slight roasty quality at the start, but it did settle off into a lively dark berry aspect, followed by a very clean and defined melon component, sweet and vibrant with a lot of fresh fruit characteristics to it. So these first couple of impressions have been quite positive, actually. We continue on to day 18, opted for the April brewer, and this was by far the most disappointing day I had experienced to this point, as it was significantly less clean and more of the roasty aspects of this one were pronounced in notable abundance, including a very strong smoky quality. The listed grape is a little bit more heavy, as the cup in general felt a little bit less defined, and I was kind of surprised that this was a washed geisha on this day specifically, because it was offering some maybe more heavy natural characteristics to it. So not necessarily my favorite. We continue on to day 21 and opted for the Chemex with Monogram's recipe. And it was another nice day of this coffee, as it continued to offer a very fruit-forward vibrancy to the cup, with the listed melon being in notable abundance yet again and on the sweeter side of things. The cinnamon note did feel apt, as it was in line with the slight development and smokiness of the cup, but for the most part it was pretty clean, with the roasty qualities definitely being felt within the cup itself. Day 23 opted for the V60 with Monogram's recipe, and it was interesting how many natural-like characteristics the coffee did seem to offer, even though it wasn't quite a natural processed coffee. Almost blueberry-like with the fresh fruit aspect, as well as an abundance of melon and a very strong notable spice yet again. So these things have been pretty notable, as they were very pronounced right from the onset of this one, so there are notes that we're going to go back to quite a bit. Day 26 stuck with Monogram's recipe, and the same results, as the coffee did continue to offer some more of the developed profile, but it was made up for by the very strong, vibrant fruit aspects of this one. Listed cinnamon is also notable, with a fair bit of sweetness as well, so it's another good day. Kind of repeating myself on these notes, but you'll kind of see it's demonstrated in the tasting wheel. On day 29, the coffee felt like it might have possibly dropped off ever so slightly, as there was a little less of the fresh fruit aspect in place of a little bit more of a chocolate spice-like quality to it. It's still offering an abundance of the darker berry fruit, including the listed grape, some more of those kind of blueberry-like components to it, but an okay day on this day, as I was starting to see maybe this coffee dropping off a little bit, as once again on day 32, it was a little less intense today. here on day 38. It's not quite as intense as it had been on previous days, but felt more toned down in general. Still vibrant nonetheless, as the darker berries remain the most dominant aspect of this coffee, with the spice coming through a little bit more towards the end. All right, let's go ahead and put up the tasting wheel so you can see what we're getting. And we have quite a few level 4s. So we will start with the cleanliness level 4. And interestingly enough, I would actually say that this might be on the lower side of the level 4 because it did feel a little bit more like a natural processed coffee. And I think that might have been the biggest surprise for me in this tasting wheel because it is a washed Colombian Gesha. So on paper, in theory, it should at least be on the higher side of the level 4, if not right there at that middle part of the level 4. But there were times with this coffee that I did toy around with the idea of maybe bumping that all the way down to level 3. So it still did reach that level 4 mark, but even then, I'm kind of surprised by that result. Finish, level 4. Yes, and while this one does have a very strong, almost natural-like vibrancy to it, it's not in any sense overbearing, so I'm actually quite happy with that being there at that level 4 mark. Sweetness, level 4. Yes, and that is probably one of the better aspects of this coffee because there's a lot of fresh fruit sweetness to it, just fruit sweetness in general, in addition to some other sweet components to it. Of course, that being that slight spice-like quality as well as that slight chocolate-like quality to it. But for the most part, the sweetness is measured by that very strong fruit component to it. Acidity, level 4, yes, and that did surprised me a little bit, as this one did have a little bit more brightness than on paper it should have, as I probably wasn't expecting it to maybe have as much of that bright aspect as it did. But acidity still kind of reached pretty high for this tasting wheel, level 4, interesting in that sense. Spice, level 4, yes, and going into this one, I was kind of surprised to see the cinnamon note listed on here. But given just how pronounced and notable it was within this coffee, I think it did take me back that it reached that level 4 and it was quite as strong as it was. So yeah, level 4 for the spice, definitely justified in this tasting wheel. Grapefruit, level 4. Yes, and as I kind of mentioned, that's the first thing I did notice. I do think that they have something along the lines of a grape popsicle list on here. But yes, it is much more of a darker berry component to it and a little bit more in terms of the sweetened fresh fruit as opposed to maybe some more tart, darker berries. So level 4 definitely feels justified and is very sugary, very sweet in that sense. Then we have a lot of level 3s, and we'll start with the florality, level 3. Yes, and it's not something I've mentioned too much in this tasting wheel, but it is a lot of those darker florals as well. So I think that's pretty much in line with the listed darker profile of this coffee in general, those dark aspects, darker florality components as well. Saltiness, level 3. Yes, and that's another one that was kind of surprising, as it did have a very sort of slight nutty quality to it, and I think that that was maybe compounded by the other classically South American characteristics that was present in this one. So level 3, yes, to my surprise. Citrus fruit, level 3, yes, and in terms of the fruit qualities to it, there's actually a fair bit of them in notable measure, as you're seeing that citrus fruit getting there, and I would say that it's on the slightly better side of things, as you can see the bitterness scoring on that level 3 mark as well. Stone fruit, level 3, yes, there are times where I could say that it even felt a little peachy, but oftentimes when I get a nice blueberry quality to it, it is often accompanied by a peachy quality to it. So those two things, yes, I feel like they do justify those level 3 marks. As well as the chocolate, this one had a bit of a classical South American component to it, and that of course being a slightly more notable chocolate. But I think given that this one had a little bit more of these natural-like qualities to them, then the chocolate did justify that level 3 mark, as that's something I typically get in a little bit more of a heavier manner with more processed coffees, even though this one wasn't. Smokiness, level 3, yes, and that's where the roast profile of this one comes into play. Honestly, it's fully what I expected going into reviewing Monogram's coffees. I don't think that their roast profile has changed much since last time I have reviewed them, so they aren't necessarily the lightest roasting coffee roaster out there. They do share a lot of characteristics and similarities with a lot of other Canadian coffee roasters, though they do seem to be skewing a little bit more on the modern, lighter side of things. This one, though, still has a lot of those smoky qualities to it. This one may be the most notable of the 3 coffees that we're going to be discussing from Monogram. But I do think it did play a role in how this coffee did end up turning out. Bitterness, level 3. Yes, as I kind of mentioned, there's a slight citric bitter quality to this one. And then the last thing that's worth discussing is the body at a level 3. Yes, and that could be attributed to the fact that I opted for the V60 with this one, but even then we do have a South American coffee. It might be a Gesha, and in theory you might expect it to be lighter bodied, but I did make the tasting wheels alongside each other, all three of these coffees, and this one did have a little bit more of a medium body relative to some of the other coffees that we're going to be discussing. So I do feel that this one was justified at that level 3 as well, but as I'm looking back on this tasting wheel, I do think that it's a pretty good representation of what I was getting from this coffee. All right, so my overall thoughts and impressions of this coffee, I had mostly mixed feelings on it. I think that I went into this one expecting it to maybe be the most clean of these coffees, and I did go into it with a little bit of curiosity given that the notes weren't necessarily in line with what I might have expected for what this coffee is. So those two things kind of put together did lead to a coffee that had much more vibrancy to it, had much more of a natural characteristic to it in general. So there are positives to always take away when you have maybe a slightly more clean, natural processed coffee, including that you experience great vibrancy while at the same time offering that great clarity. But at the same time, what really seemed to kind of hinder this one for me was I was looking for a lot more clarity in this one. I was looking for that minimum 4, high 4, level 5 sort of clarity to it, while still offering maybe these components in a much more subtle manner. But none of the things in this coffee were necessarily subtle, as a lot of the fruit characteristics were very pronounced. That spicy character was very pronounced, and as a result, you had a much more intense cup of coffee than I might have been hoping for going into it. So as a result, if I'm looking at this from a perspective of natural processed coffee, I do think that this is an excellent natural processed coffee. But since it's a wash processed coffee, it's not quite what I was looking for, so had kind of mixed feelings on it overall. Type of person I would suggest this coffee to is actually more of your natural processed coffee drinker, because again, I could not help but notice just how many natural characteristics this one did seem to offer, most specifically that fruit vibrancy, as well as it being in line with those darker berry components to it, because this one offered that in significant abundance. Didn't take a whole lot of work to get that out of this coffee. Couple that with an interesting spice quality to it while still offering great clarity. It does make for a specific type of coffee drinker that might enjoy this one. Also keep in mind the roast profile, as this one did have a slight bit of a smoky quality to it as well. I think that's the best way I can end this review. If you by chance had an opportunity to try this coffee, I'd love to know your thoughts and impressions of it as well. If you're enjoying the content, give this video a like, subscribe if not already subscribed. And this right here has been a review of the La Terraza wash processed Colombia from Monogram Coffee. Thank you for watching.